About to go get this $1,000 out for the fans, man. Really, I'm gonna take out 20,000, man. Just to show people, you feel me? I'm on a whole different level with this, man. I take this serious, man. So you can't put me in the same category. You feel me, man? I don't play no games. You feel me? I don't play no games, man. I do this for real, bro.
This is the 42-year-old Yolanda Holmes, a respected Chicago salon owner and devoted mother whose life was taken after her own son, a popular rapper, paid a hitman just $70 to kill her for over $70,000. In the early morning hours of September 2, 2012, police were dispatched to an apartment on 1000 block of West Montrose Avenue, Chicago, Illinois, following a frantic 911 call. When officers arrived, they found Yolanda Holmes inside her bedroom. She had endured multiple stab wounds and a gunshot to the head. But when the police investigated, there were no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared stolen. The scene didn't resemble a random attack. At least that's what it seemed. What investigators would eventually uncover was not a crime driven by panic or impulse, but one shaped by money, control, and a plan that had been quietly set in motion by her own son. But before we get to that, we have to go back to where everything started. This is the life and death of Yolanda Holmes. Yolanda Holmes was born between 1996 and 1997 into a working-class Chicago reality that demanded strength early and often. She grew up on Chicago's North Side, surrounded by a mix of hustle, community ties, and the quiet understanding that survival often depended on how hard you were willing to work. In the aspect of survival, Yolanda wanted to ensure life security, and so she valued trades, certifications, and hands-on knowledge over titles that did not guarantee income. That mindset reflected her larger worldview. Yolanda did not believe in waiting for the opportunity to arrive, and that belief would soon take physical form. Yolanda found her calling in cosmetology, a field that blended entrepreneurship, creativity, and community connection. Hair was not just a service to her, it was a form of care. After training and gaining experience, she went on to found Nappy Head Salon in uptown Chicago, a space that would become far more than a business address. Nappy Head Salon was an extension of Yolanda herself. It was a place where people felt seen. Clients came in for haircuts, braids, styles, but they stayed for conversation, encouragement, and quiet acts of kindness. Yolanda worked long hours, often 6 days a week, building her business from the ground up. But while Yolanda was building a business that supported others, another chapter of her life was forming, one that would quietly shape everything that came next. That chapter began with a man named Jeffrey Todd Wilson. Jeffrey Todd Wilson was deeply embedded in Chicago's gang culture. Violence wasn't a distant possibility in his life, it was a defining element. And when Yolanda entered a relationship with him, she was aware of that reality. But what mattered most was what happened next. When Yolanda became pregnant, she made a decision early on. Her child would not be raised in that world. She began creating distance, emotionally and practically, from Jeffrey's lifestyle. She leaned harder into work. She prepared for motherhood with the understanding that protection would require sacrifice. And that decision would soon become permanent. In the early 1990s, Jeffrey Todd Wilson was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The conviction removed him from his son's daily life, but it also confirmed everything Yolanda had been trying to guard against. From that point forward, she became a single mother in every sense of the word. Her son, Kwame Wilson, was born into a life Yolanda carefully controlled. She did everything she could to insulate him from the environment his father came from. Kwame did not grow up on street corners. He wasn't surrounded by gang activity. He had structure, supervision, and access to opportunities many children in the neighborhood did not. And for years, Yolanda believed she was succeeding. She raised Kwame alone, providing stability through relentless effort. She worked long hours, she managed finances carefully, she made sure he had what he needed, and often more than that. She bought him a car, she dressed him well, she gave him a job at her salon so he would never have to hustle or rely on street money. To Yolanda, this was love, but over time, the dynamic began to change. As Kwame grew into adolescence and then adulthood, the protection Yolanda provided became something else in his eyes. By his early 20s, he began building a public identity under the name Young QC. He wasn't just making music, he was crafting an image. Online, he projected success, designer clothing, luxury watches, expensive cars, stacks of cash. To followers, it looked like ambition and confidence. But behind the image was a growing contradiction. Kwame's music was not generating the income his lifestyle suggested. The money funding his appearance didn't come from record deals or performances. It came from the stability Yolanda had built and controlled. And that control began to matter. Yolanda managed money carefully. She didn't hand over unrestricted access to her finances. She questioned spending. She set boundaries. To her, this was responsibility. To Kwame, it felt limiting. And slowly, the relationship shifted. Kwame had grown up without needing to struggle. He never had to choose between survival and ambition. Over time, that absence of hardship reshaped his perspective. Support began to feel like entitlement. Guidance began to feel like restriction. Meanwhile, Yolanda continued doing what she had always done. Working, providing, and protecting, believing she was still guiding her son towards safety and independence. But the gap between them was widening. This wasn't a relationship defined by constant conflict or dramatic arguments. There were no obvious warning signs, no public breakdown. What existed instead was a quiet fracture, one built through resentment, impatience, and a growing desire for control. And while Yolanda continued believing she was protecting her son, Kwame began to see her differently. Because the foundation she built to keep him safe was no longer being seen as love. It was being seen as an obstacle. And that shift, subtle, unspoken, and ignored, would set everything else in motion. But just when it seemed like the story had settled into routine, something underneath it was already changing. And that change would soon become impossible to ignore. But what Yolanda didn't know was that the fracture between mother and son had already crossed a line. By late summer of 2012, Kwame Wilson was no longer operating out of frustration alone. What had once been tension had shifted into planning, quiet, deliberate, and hidden from view. Without Yolanda's knowledge, he began involving other people in decisions that would permanently alter her life. And that is where this story stops being a story about family strain and becomes something far more calculated. On the evening of September 1st, 2012, Kwame Wilson met with a longtime friend, Eugene Spencer. This was not a spontaneous meeting or a conversation fueled by emotion. There was no argument leading up to it, no visible crisis forcing a split-second choice. What unfolded instead followed a structure. Kwame provided Spencer with a gun. He gave him the security code to Yolanda's apartment building. He walked him through the layout of the unit and explained when Yolanda would most likely be asleep. The details mattered, and Kwame made sure nothing was left to chance. He was clear about what he expected to happen once Spencer went inside. Meanwhile, another part of the plan was already set in motion. Nearby, that same night, was Lorana Johnson, Kwame's girlfriend at the time. Her role was specific and limited. She was to wait in the car and be ready to leave once Spencer came back out. There was no confusion about where she needed to be or what she needed to do. Everyone involved understood their place in the sequence. But the most unsettling aspect of the plan had nothing to do with weapons or timing. It relied entirely on Yolanda's sense of safety. There was no forced entry anticipated, no broken door or shattered window. The security code Kwame provided ensured that Spencer could enter the building unnoticed. Yolanda would not hear someone breaking in. She would have no warning at all. Just before 4 a.m. on September 2nd, 2012, Spencer entered the apartment building on 1000 block of West Montrose Avenue in the Uptown neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois, using the code he had been given. The building was quiet, with most residents asleep. Nothing about the entry stood out or drew attention. Inside Yolanda's apartment, everything appeared normal. She was asleep in her bedroom, lying next to her boyfriend, Curtis Wyatt. The door was closed, the lights were off, and there was no indication that anything was wrong until it was. Spencer walked directly to the bedroom. A single gunshot broke the silence. Yolanda was struck in the head while still in bed. Wyatt woke up immediately, disoriented and confused, and moved towards the intruder. A struggle followed in the confined space of the bedroom. Spencer used the gun as a blunt object, striking Wyatt repeatedly until he lost consciousness. After that, Spencer left the apartment. At that point, the situation could have ended there. Yolanda was critically injured, and Spencer had a clear path to leave, but the plan did not stop with his exit. Moments later, Spencer's phone rang. It was Kwame Wilson, and in that call, Kwame made another instruction to Spencer. The instruction was direct. He was told to return and make sure Yolanda was dead. That call changed the trajectory of everything that followed. Spencer went back inside. Yolanda was still in the bed where he had left her. This time, the gun was not used. Spencer pulled out a knife and stopped her multiple times. There was no struggle reported and no interruption. When he left the apartment for the second time, the plan, as Kwame had defined it, was complete. Minutes later, Curtis Wyatt regained consciousness. He found Yolanda unresponsive and bleeding in the bedroom. He managed to reach his phone and called 911, struggling to explain what had happened. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but Yolanda Holmes was pronounced dead at the scene. In the immediate aftermath, the crime scene offered investigators very little clarity. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared to be stolen. The apartment did not show evidence of a burglary or a random attack. Wyatt could only describe waking to the sound of a gunshot, engaging with an unknown intruder, and then losing consciousness. He had no explanation for why Yolanda would have been targeted. For weeks, the investigation moved slowly. Detectives followed leads tied to Yolanda's business, her finances, and her personal relationships. They re-examined the apartment and interviewed people who knew her well. Without a break-in or a clear motive, progress remained limited. But the most critical evidence was not found inside the apartment. It was hidden in phone records. More than a year later, investigators reviewing Yolanda's cellular account noticed something that had previously gone overlooked. 2 phone lines were registered under her name. One showed routine usage. The other showed unusual activity around the time of her death. That second number belonged to Kwame Wilson. Once detectives examined the call logs, the timeline became unmistakable. There were repeated calls between Kwame and Eugene Spencer before, during, and after the murder. The sequence was precise and consistent. When Spencer was brought in for questioning, the structure of the crime finally came into focus. He admitted that Kwame had offered him money to kill Yolanda. He described being given the gun, the building's security code, and instructions on how to carry out the plan. He also confirmed receiving the call telling him to return and finish the job. For his role, Spencer said he was paid only $70. Investigators then confirmed Loriana Johnson's involvement as the getaway driver. The roles were now clear. Kwame planned the killing, Spencer carried it out, and Johnson facilitated the escape. In December 2013, all 3 were arrested. As prosecutors began outlining the motive, it became evident that the crime was not driven by panic or impulse. The evidence pointed instead to financial access, control, and the desire to maintain an image that Kwame could not support on his own. Yolanda's money represented freedom to him, and her presence represented a limit on how far he could go. In that context, Yolanda was no longer seen as a provider. She was treated as an obstacle. And the woman who had spent her life protecting her son was killed because of it. But the case was far from over, because when the story reached a courtroom years later, the public would see how Kwame handled the aftermath, not with silence or restraint, but with spectacle. And that next chapter would expose just how deeply image factored into everything he did. As the case moved toward trial, the focus shifted from what happened inside Yolanda's apartment to what happened afterwards and how Kwame Wilson chose to behave once his mother was gone. Investigators followed the financial trail almost immediately. Within months of Yolanda's death, nearly $70,000 were withdrawn from her accounts. Surveillance footage showed Kwame walking into a bank and pulling out tens of thousands of dollars in cash. Those withdrawals were not subtle, and they were not followed by any attempt to hide the money. Instead, he did the opposite. Videos soon surfaced online showing him throwing cash into crowds, recording their reactions, and presenting himself as someone with money to spare. The clips spread quickly. To prosecutors, they were not acts of generosity. They were evidence of motive, timing, and intent. The money being displayed matched the funds taken from Yolanda's accounts. The performance came directly after her death. And that behavior became central to how the case was understood. As detectives pieced together the timeline, it became clear that Kwame had not unraveled after the killing. He had leaned into the image he wanted people to see. The persona he had cultivated online, wealthy, successful, untouchable, continued uninterrupted even as Yolanda's death remained officially unsolved. That gap between the crime and Kwame's public presentation did not go unnoticed. When prosecutors formally charged Kwame Wilson, Eugene Spencer, and Laura Anna Johnson in December 2013, the case was built on layers of evidence rather than a single confession. Phone records placed Kwame in constant contact with Spencer during the critical window. Spencer's statements were corroborated by call logs, location data, and the structure of the plan itself. Johnson's role as the getaway driver was confirmed through her own admissions and supporting evidence. The charges were severe. Kwame Wilson was charged with first-degree murder, home invasion, and solicitation to commit murder. Eugene Spencer faced first-degree murder and attempted murder related to the attack on Curtis Wyatt. Laura Anna Johnson was charged for her role in facilitating the crime. But even with arrests made, the case took years to reach trial. During that time, Yolanda's family waited. Her salon closed. The community that had once gathered around her chairs and mirrors lost a place that had been more than a business. For many in Uptown, her absence was not abstract. It was felt in routines that no longer existed. When the trial finally began in 2019, the courtroom was filled with family members, former clients, reporters, and people who knew her for years. The prosecution laid out the case step by step, focusing on planning, coordination, and motive rather than emotion. One of the most striking moments came when the jury was shown the videos of Kwame withdrawing money and throwing cash into crowds. Prosecutors argued that the footage demonstrated intent and mindset. This was not someone overwhelmed by grief or panic. This was someone actively benefiting from the crime and using it to reinforce a public image. The defense attempted to distance Kwame from the act itself, arguing that he had not physically committed the murder and questioning the credibility of Spencer's testimony. They challenged the use of the videos, claiming they were prejudicial and unrelated to the killing. But the structure of the evidence held. Phone records aligned with Spencer's account. The building code Kwame provided explained the lack of forced entry. The timing of the calls matched the moment Spencer returned to the apartment. The financial withdrawals followed immediately after Yolanda's death. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the court addressed the weight of the crime directly. The judge spoke about the breach of trust involved and the deliberate nature of the planning. Kwame Wilson was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Eugene Spencer received a 100-year sentence for his role. Laura Anna Johnson was sentenced to 14 years for her role in the crime. Outside the courtroom, the reaction was a mix of relief, anger, and disbelief. For many, the crime was difficult to process, not because of its violence alone, but because of who was responsible. A mother who had spent her life protecting her son was killed through a plan he orchestrated.
Just to show people, you feel me, I'm on a whole different level with this, man. I take this serious, man. So you can't put me in the same category as the others.
In the years since the trial, Yolanda Holmes has continued to be remembered in the neighborhood she helped shape. Former clients still talk about her generosity, her work ethic, and the way she made people feel seen. The salon she built is gone, but her presence remains part of the community's memory. Kwame Wilson remains incarcerated, his appeals unsuccessful. Eugene Spencer continues to serve his sentence. Laurana Johnson has since been released, though her role in the case has not been forgotten by those who followed it closely. The story of Yolanda Holmes does not end neatly with a verdict. It lingers as a reminder of how entitlement can grow unchecked, how image can become more important than humanity, and how betrayal does not always come from the outside. Sometimes it comes from the person who was given everything. Yolanda built a life around providing, protecting, and giving without condition. She believed that support would lead to stability and that opportunity would lead to gratitude. What she could not have imagined was that the very structure she built would be used against her. And that is what makes this case endure, not just because of how Yolanda died, but because of what her life represented and how completely it was taken from her. What do you think about it? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you found this story intriguing, please like, share, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.